Hey, this is Dane from featheredprop.com. Thanks for joining me today. Once again, I want to apologize to my regular subscribers who over the years have come to this channel for outdoor videos. This is not at all like that. There's so much going on in the world today, and as a Christian, I wanted to kind of address some things. In fact, I've been asked by some friends to address some things, and that's where this has happened, or that's where this video comes from. And so I'm going to do that again today. To the new subscribers, thanks for subscribing. Thanks for coming back to check out this video. Briefly, I was a pastor for 11 years. I've done missionary work after that, and currently I go every week to the local county jail where I lead Bible studies among the inmates. I also go to the local state prison, although I'm currently not there because of COVID, but that has sort of become my congregation. I've been doing that for almost a decade now, both state and local prisons, and that's just sort of where I'm coming from. So in my last video, I talked about Pastor Dana Coverstone's first video in which he talked about a prophecy that he believes he was given having to do with some events in the United States. And I talked about that a little bit. And I also said that I was going to talk about his next video in which he talked about a prophecy regarding a coming persecution of the church. And that's what I want to talk about today. But first, I want to talk about and by the way, stick to the end of this if you would, because I have what I believe is sort of a positive note, a word of encouragement, because I know this has caused a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety with a lot of people, so kind of just hang in there. In my last video, there were a lot of encouraging notes, and some people disagree with me, and that's fine. But there was a lot of people asking why I would even do what I'm doing, why I even question. Matter of fact, this particular viewer writes, why do you have to critique what someone else has said concerning what they say God has given to them? So I want to address that because I think it's important to do so. In the book of Corinthians, Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, and he said, let 2 or 3 prophets speak, and let the others judge. In other words, if you have 2 or 3 prophets in an assembly talking and they're speaking for the Lord, let the other ones judge or discern what they are saying. In other words, let them determine whether this is a word from the Lord or whether it's not. We have to use discernment. We have to figure out what God is saying and if a voice is from God or not. That's imperative, I believe. And so that's why I'm doing this. This is not to tear apart anybody else's ministry. This is me trying to figure out the voice of God and all the voices out there. And that's just what this is all about. Let me talk about prophecy first a little bit. First of all, I do believe that the gifts of the Spirit are for today. There are some who believe that they ceased with the formation of the New Testament. They believe that the gifts of the Spirit are no longer for the church. I'm not of that camp. I believe that they are for the church. God gives them as He directs. And so I am open to the gift of prophecy. I believe that prophecy has occurred over the years. I believe that God does speak to His church and sometimes gives warnings to the church. Matter of fact, we can see this in the book of Acts. A prophet by the name of Agabus predicted a famine, and that famine, in fact, did occur. He also told Paul that he would be bound, when he comes to Jerusalem, he would be bound, which also came to pass. So we see that gift operating in terms of warnings. Another, I think, well-documented case comes to us from a early 4th century writer by the name of Eusebius. He wrote a book called the Church History. I have a copy of that in my library. I recommend you get a hold of that book, and I think most scholars consider it fairly trustworthy. He writes that just prior to the destruction of the temple, which occurred in 70 AD, the Christians received an oracle from the Lord telling them to flee, to get out of the city. Now, of course, Jesus said this also. He said, whenever you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then it's time to get out. But apparently, Eusebius had information that the Christians in the city of Jerusalem, prior to Rome laying siege to it, received the word from the Lord that they had to get out. And in fact, they did. They got out, and as a result, they avoided the horrible Holocaust of the siege as Rome took Jerusalem and tore down the temple. Another, I think, well-documented prophecy that a church had occurred in and around 1855 by a 11 or 12-year-old Russian boy who lived in a section of Armenia. and he claimed to have had a revelation from God. Reportedly, this young boy was illiterate, which makes the prophecy stand out because, according to sources, he somehow was able to write out the prophecy. And the prophecy was a prediction that destruction, that a Holocaust was coming to the Christians there, and that they were also to flee the area. Reportedly, he drew maps or charts or something like that, which indicated they were supposed to come to America. And many did. It began a great exodus of Armenians out of that area to the United States. In fact, the young boy himself later came. He died in Los Angeles. I have a picture of his tombstone. I can't pronounce his name, I'm sorry, but he died in the United States. And what happened is in around 1914, the Turks invaded the area and just carry out systematic genocide of these people. Horrible things occurred there. But as a result of this prophecy, the people of Armenia were able to escape that that particular horrific happening. So we do know, I believe, that prophecy does occur. Those are two well-documented cases outside of the Bible that we have, and I know there are many more. I'm not saying that they're the only two. I'm just picking two that are fairly well-documented by sources that we feel are reliable, that these are cases where Christians were warned about coming disasters. But I also will say that there have been a number of false prophecies over the years, and I want to talk about that. For example, in and around 1844, a pastor by the name of William Miller, a Baptist pastor, predicted that Christ would return on October 22nd, 1844. He made this prediction. He was apparently a very fervent preacher, and he convinced thousands of people, from what I understand, that the Lord was going to return on this date in October in 1844. This became later known as the Great Disappointment because Christ did not return, and people, from what I understand, people actually wore white robes waiting to meet the Lord from the sky. And they were so convinced by this man's preaching, they really were greatly disappointed. Many people had prepared their lives to meet their Lord on that day because he told them so, but it was a failed prophecy and left many people very disappointed. One that in my time that I recall is Hal Lindsey. Hal Lindsey wrote a very best-selling book called The Late Great Planet Earth in the 70s. And although he didn't set a date for Christ's return, he did strongly suggest that it was going to occur sometime during the 80s. He believed that from 1948, when Israel formed as a nation, it would be about one generation. And so he really believed that Christ was going to return sometime in the 80s. This book became a bestseller. I remember as in my youth group in the 70s, this book was a hot item. Everybody was passionate around. We were talking about it. We were reading about it. We thought the return of Christ was imminent, and we really believed these words. We really thought this was going to take place. And it didn't. This book is still available on Amazon, and remarkably, it still has good reviews. I'm not sure how that works, but you can still get that on Amazon. The next, I remember in the 80s hearing a man by the name of Wisenott, Edgar Wisenott, being interviewed on a radio. He had just written a book called 88 Reasons Why Jesus Will Return, or why the Rapture will occur in 1988. I believe you can still get copies of that book on Amazon. And actually, you can put that into your wedding registry if you like, apparently. So you can get that classic piece of literature. I remember his interview. He had all these reasons why Jesus was going to return. This guy was a former NASA engineer, so he was extremely intelligent, we would take it to be, but he missed it. He missed the mark. Jesus did not return in 1988. One that I was very familiar with, very contemporary to a lot of the listeners here, is Harold Camping. He's a sort of a family radio pastor for many, many years. And he predicted that Christ was going to return, or the rapture was going to occur on May 21st, 2011. Many people were convinced by this man's teaching. I heard him on the radio personally. He was defending his position. He had this mathematical formula that he had worked out. Jesus was going to return on May 21st. And people would ask him, well, what are you going to do on the 22nd if this doesn't happen? He said, there is going to be no 22nd. I'm not going to be here. He was absolutely convinced that Jesus was going to return. People sold a lot of their belongings. People funneled money into the ministry. He actually purchased billboards all over the country trying to warn people that the rapture was going to occur, and he wanted them to turn. Now, for those of you keeping score, Jesus did not return on May 21st, 2011. Harold Camping kind of rehuddled, looked at his calculations, realized he had made a mistake, reset the date for in October of that same year, and Jesus did not return again in October. From what I understand, I think he later confessed that what he had done was wrong. He suffered a stroke, if I'm not mistaken, got put into a nursing home, and he died in 2013. Actually, and I recall one, this is not documented, but I just recall one in particular, personal. Back in the 80s, I grew up in a Methodist church, very conservative in terms of the gifts of the Spirit and so on and so forth, but was invited by a friend in the 80s to attend a charismatic, non-denominational church, and I went there, and during this service, during the prayer meeting or whatever it was, a man stood up and started prophesying. He said, "Thus saith the Lord." I'd never heard this before. I was taken by this. And he said that on the day that Pat Robertson is inaugurated as President of the United States, he is going to turn into the camera and he is going to prophesy over this nation and pronounce judgment. And I don't know. He went on and on and on. And I remember thinking, wow, I have inside information. I'm going to go home tonight knowing Pat Robertson is going to be the next president of the United States. But as the months went by, it quickly became obvious he wasn't even going to make it past the primary. So I kind of held on a little bit of hope, but it never occurred. Now, that was a false prophecy, and I had heard it myself. I was there that night when this was spoken. And it affected me. It really did. I'm a sort of a pragmatist. I mean, I've been an investigator for 35 years. My job requires me to, as unemotionally as I can, examine the evidence and try to formulate conclusions and so on and so forth. And that really affected me when this man spoke this. I thought, you know what? I got to be careful about what I hear. I'm following Jesus, but not every voice out there is the voice of Jesus. Now, I'm not saying that Pastor Dana Coverstone is speaking falsely. I'm making that clear. It could well be that he has heard a message from the Lord. We will find out. His first message, he didn't kind of release it till after the first two dates he had given had come by. He talked about March, something happened in March, something happened in June, and by that time the message was the video was already made available. But he has talked about two other dates. One is September, something is going to happen then, and something cataclysmic is going to happen in November. So if we see something big in September, if we see something cataclysmic in November, then we'll know that he actually did hear from the Lord. And that's about all we can do. Now, some people wrote to me or put on the YouTube page that they themselves have had a dream, that this has been confirmed, that they've had the confirmation. And that's fine. That's fine. But my question is, what about us who have not had a confirmation? Now, I have prayed about this. I have seriously prayed about his visions. I've prayed about it, trying to get some sort of word from the Lord. And I have to say, I have not got any confirmation, nor have I received any word that says that this is not of God. And so I'm left with my resources. I'm left with, the ability to just kind of think through this process, and that's what I'm doing. And I'm hoping that I'm being led by the Lord. But bottom line is this, and every time I lead Bible studies at the jail, I tell the guys every time, listen, I am not an authority. I'm a guy like you trying to figure this out. Yes, I was a pastor, but I was not formally trained. I'll tell you what I know. I'll tell you what I believe. But in the end, you have to think about this. You have to work this out. This is your walk, not mine. I walk my own walk. You walk your walk. I'll do the best that I can to help you, but you have to think through this yourself. And I believe with God's help we can. And that's all that I'm trying to do, is just process some of this information. So prophecies do exist. And false prophecies do exist. And we have to be careful about them because the false prophecies, as I've already talked about here, they have drawn many people who probably said, man, I feel that this guy's telling the truth. This resonates with me. I feel it in my spirit that he is telling the truth. And in the end, the people that I just listed weren't telling the truth about the dates and things that they had talked about. They had predicted falsely. And so I don't think we can always rely on our feelings concerning this. We have to judge in other ways. And that's what I'm doing here today, talking about this. Now, Pastor Coverstone's second video talking about the persecution, I have a link in it below. You can go watch that. I'm not going to cover all the details, but in essence, what he did is he saw in his dream that if I said the word vision, I was wrong. He called it a dream. It wasn't a vision, a dream, I guess. But in this dream, he saw wolves coming into churches. And these wolves apparently began to agitate. And I found this kind of interesting. They began to agitate people in the pew whom he described as being, well, I don't know how he described them, but they were sort of nominal Christians, or they weren't even Christians. They were there, they were in the churches, but they weren't part of that core group, as he calls them, of people who were praying and seeking God. So, it doesn't sound like they had a relationship with Jesus, but these wolves who came into the service agitated them, and they rose up and began to persecute the pastors. And so his message is brace yourself, there's a coming persecution. Now, to that I'd have to say, well, the Bible does say that too, that Jesus told us that persecutions would come. The United States, for reasons God knows, has for a long time been immune. We've been insulated to persecutions, but that doesn't mean that the rest of the world has. As a matter of fact, churches all over the world or churches and Christians have been and are continuing to be persecuted. I've always had a heart for the persecuted church. Matter of fact, I wear this necklace. It's the Arabic letter N, or the Nun, was put out by the Voice of the Martyrs to remember the persecuted church. I'm a follower of the Nazarene. And I've sent letters to pastors in prisons across the world. Every day at 8:38, my phone goes off to remind me to pray for the persecuted church. I've been doing that for years. That's a Voice of the Martyrs kind of thing. So I've always been, not always, but I have been for a number of years, I have been very much interested, and my heart goes out to the persecuted church. But I also know that probably our time in America, our time here, is coming. Now that's up for the Lord to decide. Perhaps He's insulated us from persecution so that we would support the other churches for a time being. I don't know what the plans of God are. But if someone were to say that persecution is coming, I'm going to say, well, sure, it's got to. I think it does. So this prophecy really doesn't change anything for me, if it is indeed a prophecy. From what I recall, he also didn't give a timeline to it. I'm not sure when this is exactly going to occur. I get the sense, and I could be wrong about this, and if I'm wrong, maybe if you've watched the video and he did give a timeline, maybe you can put in the comments below. But I didn't get a sense that he gave a timeline, but my sense was this was soon. This was going to happen soon, that we were that the church, and especially pastors who were preaching the gospel, were going to very soon begin to face persecution, which again I find interesting to come from the church itself. And that may well be. Paul warned the church in the book of Acts that savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. He told this to the church, or the leaders from Ephesus in Acts chapter 20. But I find that interesting. They'll come in among you as if from the inside. So Paul warned the church in Ephesus that they were going to experience this. And we have no record of how that played out that I'm aware of. But the warning there was that from the inside there would be persecutions. And he called them wolves incidentally. So again, it doesn't surprise me that someone might say that persecutions are coming. We have enjoyed 200 plus years here in the United States where we've been relatively free from persecution, organized persecution, maybe even governmental persecution, but it could be that that time will end. Now, I know as some people hear that message, it's frightening, it's disturbing, and they wonder, how in the world they can get through that, because his message is brace yourself and endure to the end. This is something you need to do, and I agree with that. And let me just say this, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul describes the thorn in the flesh that he has, and he tries to have it taken away from him. He prays that God would do that, and God did, and God just says, my grace is sufficient for you, that in your weakness you are made stronger. His strength comes through Paul's weakness. I think sometimes as we look on the outside of a problem, as we look on the outside of persecutions, as we look on the outside of some sort of suffering, it's kind of hard to imagine passing through that. We think, I could never do that. I don't have the strength to go through that. But I think it's in the midst of those things that God gives us the grace. He doesn't give us the grace to endure the things on the outside. It seems that once those sufferings, once those tribulations and trials begin, then we find the grace of God able to endure. And there's a story I'm going to tell you. I love this story. It comes out of the Anabaptist traditions. I have a great fondness for the Anabaptists. In and around the 1500s, I think it's around 1527. This story comes out of the Martyr's Mirror, a fantastic book. It's on my library. It's a very edifying book. Hard on the stomach at times because it's brutal and it's difficult, but this story is just fantastic. There was a man by the name of Michael Sadler. He was an early Anabaptist who was arrested for his faith. The Anabaptists, of course, refused to have their children baptized because they thought baptism was for adults only, and they made enemies with not just the state, but also with the Catholics and the Protestants of their day, and so they were hunted oftentimes by all three of these groups. But in any event, Michael Sadler was arrested for his views. He was put on trial, and one thing that they often noticed is when these Anabaptists went to their deaths, they would go preaching, and they would make converts while they preached, and so they often ordered that their tongues would be cut out, or they would use tongue screws. And I'm sorry for the graphic imagery, but this was the Middle Ages, and this is what happened. They wanted to make an example out of Michael Sadler, so what they did was they ordered that he would be executed. His tongue would be pulled out, and as he's taken to the place of execution, he was going to be stopped several places in town, and with hot tongues, pieces of his flesh was going to be pulled out. And they really wanted to make an example, and then he would be burned alive at the stake. And Sadler had a conversation apparently with some of his his friends, and he confessed that, I don't know how I'm going to go through this. This is going to be difficult. And so he said to his friends, when I'm going to give you a sign. If I hold up two fingers, that's going to be a sign that God's grace that I'm finding God's grace in the midst of this. And so the execution was carried out in all its gore. And again, I apologize for that, but he was taken to the place of execution. He was tied to sort of a ladder structure, and he was put in and out of the fire, just a way of torturing him. At some point, according to Martyr's Mirrors, the ropes broke free, and his friends saw him holding up his fingers. Now, the reason why I share that story is we can't interview Michael Sadler. We don't, because he died. But in the midst of that, he found that God's grace was able to sustain him, that he found the grace of God in the midst of all of that pain and all of that hurt. He didn't know on the outside how he was going to endure, but he decided to be faithful. And in the midst of that suffering, he found that God's grace was able to meet him right where he was and give him what he needed to endure. And I say that because that's an encouragement to all of us, I believe. You might be looking on the outside saying, man, I'm not ready. I don't know how I'm going to handle the suffering. I don't know how I'm going to handle loss. I don't know, what about me? What if this happens to me? What's this going to be like? And I'm just saying this, if it does happen, if God allows this to occur in our lives, he will meet us there, I believe. He will give us the grace needed to endure the things for his glory and his good. It's hard to see that now on the outside, but as Michael Sadler found out, in the midst of those flames, that's where he found the grace of God. Paul said, in my weakness, then he becomes strong. And I think that's an encouragement to those who sometimes kind of feel weak as we face uncertain times, that God will meet us there, that He will meet us in those moments, and His grace indeed will be sufficient for all of us. So I want to encourage you with that word of hope to hang on in the midst of whatever might happen. God is faithful, and He can show Himself just how faithful He will be to us.